Hi guys, picking up from where we stop, welcome to our REST API series. And in this very video we are going to first of all create an endpoint to get all users that are chef. Think of it this way: if we have a front-end app, we may desire to have a page where users can actually see the list of chef in the app. Alright, so to visualize all users are chef. And secondly, we are going to write our first unit test for this API. Alright, so that's the major part of this tutorial. We're going to be writing a unit test. So in case you're not fond of writing tests, you need to get used to it, because if you're aspiring to work in any organization, it's a skill that is often required by most employers. So you must know how to write tests for your application. So we're going to be writing our first unit test to test our different endpoints and different part of our API. Alright guys, so if you're not subscribed, please hit the subscribe button, and also give this video a thumbs up. As we proceed, a lot of videos are coming. Alright, create a class. We call this chef list view, and this is obviously going to extend the list API create view. So one of the generic API views that the REST framework provide, which is for the list. So we need that list API view by the serializer class, which is obviously going to be the user serializer. So we need to import that. We'll get the user. I believe we've registered this in our settings file. What we're going to do now is, apart from this user, we're going to also set one called current user. Alright, so if you check the user documentation, if we check the documentation for the user under settings serialization, you can see where it says key user is this for general user, whereas current user lets you set serializer for special user / me endpoint. They both default to the same serializer though. So you can see in the example of serializers, we have the user serializer and the current user. Current underscore user, which is obviously going to be the same serializer class that we defined here. And lastly, we need to specify a query set, which is going to be the user model. I think we also need to import this also. That's from our old model. Import user. So that's that. And lastly, we can set the permission class, right? And like this, we are done with our list view. But if we leave it like this, it will actually give us all the users in our model, both those that are chef and those that are not chef. So we only want users that are chef, so we are going to kind of override or extend the query set by using the get query set method. Alright, so this is a get query set method that the generic API provides, so we can override the query set by the is chef attribute. Alright, so that's the users that we want. Create the URL for this .py file and just kind of that's for our URL and tested our chef endpoint. So if we head over to, we can try and make a request to see if we can get alright, that's our endpoint. So if let's check if our server is running. Okay, sorry, let me quickly start server. Now if we try and we are not authenticated yet, so if we try and make a get request now, so we are getting the authentication credentials not provided, so we need to first of all log in. Alright, so we have our token, so we can pass it over to our header. Alright, so we can see the list of users that are chef is the chef. Alright, so we are getting the users that are only chef. Alright, so that's that. So next we are going to work on writing our tests. Alright, so for us to write tests, you can see the Django app actually comes with a test file that we can actually use to write our test, but you can actually structure your test in a more robust way, provide by creating a test folder. So we're going to delete this test file that we have here. We done that. So we're going to create inside our authentication app, we're going to create a folder. We're going to call the folder test. It's going to be our test module. So in here we're going to create the .init file to make this a Python module. Alright, the reason why we are actually putting our test in one folder is for organization purpose. It's not really a big deal. You can write all your tests in the single default test file. It will also work. But one of the important reasons why you should do it like this is when you have maybe you want to create multiple test files for different part of your app. Maybe you want to create one test file to handle tests for your model, or one test file to handle tests for your views, things like that. It is advisable to actually structure it like this. So create a file. So any file I'm going to create inside this folder will actually be prefixed with the test keyword. So I'm going to say test underscore setup .py. So this is going to be the test setup file. Then I'm going to also create another one for, let's say, test. Alright, so things like this. So if you have, maybe you want to create tests for other parts, maybe tests for the admin, tests for the model, tests for the URL.py file, you just structure them by prefixing every of the file with test followed by the parts that you want to test. So things like that. So this is how we structure it. So heading to our test setup, here we're going to write our test setup. And so first of all, from the Django REST framework provides some useful tools for us to test our API. If you go to the documentation, tests, alright, so you see different tools that are provided for us to actually test every part of our API. So I would strongly advise you actually carefully read through these parts of the documentation. So we're going to make our imports. We're going to see from the REST framework or the API test case. Alright, so and also import the user model, and so we need to get the token model. We're going to say from the REST to import the token model, because we're also going to be testing authentication. Alright, so that's that. So for our setup, we're going to create a class. This is a class that every other test that we are going to create is going to, every other test class that we're going to create is going to extend this very class, because this class is going to contain the initial test setup that we want. So we're going to call this test. This is going to extend the API, and in here we're going to define the setup method. Alright, so in this setup we are just going to define some of the initial requirements that we need to actually perform our test. Things like the endpoints, that is the URL endpoints that we want to test, and maybe some kind of initial data that we need to also use for our test. And another method that we also need to define also is the tear down method. So what this method actually does is, the way the Django or the Python unit test system works is that when you are performing your test, it actually generates a kind of temporary database model. According to the model you're working with, it generates a temporary database model for your test case, and immediately your test passes and your test is fine, it also destroys the database that is created. In that case, your initial or your project database is safe and is not your data are not being messed up. So that's what the test case actually does. It generates a kind of temporary database for your test, and after the test it deletes the temporary data. So that's what this tear down method does. So after the test passes, it destroys the temporary database that is being created. Alright, so we can just define this method and leave it like this, and in test if a new user can sign up URL, and this can just be the path to our URL, which is going to be /API /auth then / users. That's the endpoints for the API. So we can just set that up, and also we can just kind of define some kind of initial test data. We can just say user data, which is going to be addition. So this is going to be the initial test data. So for us to actually create a new user, or for a new user to sign up, we kind of need some data like the email, the username, the first name. These are like sample data. So, and lastly, sorry, this have to be with self. I'm saying self.user data because it's part of this method. So that's for the initial data, and apart from that, we'll come back to this setup again, but we just want to test if the end user can sign up. Later on, we'll create something like a test authentication in this setup also, but first of all, let's just test if a new user can sign up. So we're going to save our test setup now, and in our test view in here, we are going to import the test setup. We're saying from dot. Secondly, we are going to import the REST framework. We want to import status. Alright, so the very first test case we are going to create is to test for new user test setup class. So in here we can define our first test method. So we're going to say we want to test for new user. A common practice for you to actually name your test according to what you are testing for reasons being that if other developers have access to your code, they eventually know what you're actually testing for. And in here we want to test our sign up endpoint. So we're going to get the respond, which is going to be equals to self.client. So client method is part of the API test case that is coming from our test setup. Remember, the test setup import extend the API test case. So, and the kind of request is a post request. Alright, so this expects the URL, the data, and the format. Alright, so the URL which we already have in our setup is going to be test.self, that's the URL, and the data which we as self.user data, and then lastly we're going to say the format. We set it equals to a JSON format because that's our content type. Alright, so these are our requests. So our test is going to be want to assets. We're going to say self.assets. We have several test assets, so you can see the different test assets. This we are checking for equals to asset false, asset greater than, asset in, asset is not. These are the test assets that you need to test your requirements. So we're going to asset equals and respond to status code. Alright, so we want to check the status code that is coming with the respond. We want to check and make sure it is 201, which is our right one, which we are expecting. If the test passes is 201, which means everything was, the user was created 201. So that's our very first test. So we can save this now, and let's run our test. Okay, I don't want to really close this. Alright, so we'll create another terminal here. Alright, our virtual environment is activated, and here we're going to run our test by saying Python on it. So if we run our test, Let me expand the terminal again. You can see it say creating test database for Alice default system check, no issues, run one test the time, and you can see it says okay. Okay means that everything is fine. If there were maybe the test didn't work well, we can get test fail. You can see destroying test database, just like I said before. Alright, so if we want to fail this test, let's say we set it equals to, instead of 201 we want to set it equals to 400, which is not the right response. Alright, so we expect this test to fail. If we save this document and we come back to run this test one more time, and then let's go back, and then you can see run one test and failed. You said destroy the test database, so the test failed. Alright, so that's it. So that's our first test case. Alright, so for us to be able to test every other endpoint, the user needs to be authenticated, because most of our endpoints requires users to be authenticated. So the way we are going to handle that is, for us to test authentication, is we are going to set authentication up in our setup file, so that whenever we run every test, it will first of all run the authentication test that is set up in the test, and that we set up in the setup file, or setup method I mean, before it can perform every other test. Alright, so remember that I said that this test cases, that's why using a kind of sample database, so you can actually get existing users that are already in our database, because she's not working with our reproduction database. So what we're going to do is, inside our test file, we are going to create a user object, create underscore user, and so here we'll pass in the fields that we need to create a new user instance. So we're passing the email. Now we can as well use already defined data for testing here, but if we're going to be using this, we'll have to kind of take down this operation. If not, we'll get a kind of error message says that the user already exists, because we're kind of using the same data over again. So I will just give it some kind of new data, so I'll be able to sign up or log in to get a hot token. So once we have this instance, we can generate a token for this instance. Now that equal to, remember we imported the token model, so see token.objects. Alright, so this actually is our user object. So we generated a token for this user, and after we've done that, we have our token now in self.token, that we can authorize every kind of request with that token. So and do that, we'll create a method which is called authorization. I've not created this method yet, I'll do that soon. So this method will be called with the authorization, and below here we'll define this method. Sorry, it's gonna be self dot then here we define the method called so this method is simply going to have a self.client credential. Alright, so we're going to pass in the authorization credentials, which is the HTTP authorization. This we're going to set to a string of token, just the way we set it in our header. We're going to set it like that, and mind you, this should be on the class level. This is going to be like this. Alright, kind of concatenate is followed by the token. So the token now is going to be our self.key, because we want to access the key of the token. Alright, so with this we can start testing our other parts of our API. Now we can create a new class called, we can call it any name. So I'm going to say get, it's also going to take test setup. So the very first test is going to say we're going to test for get authenticated users. So this is taking safe. So once we are being authorized in the setup, which is the initial setup, we can send a request to the endpoints to get our logged in user credentials, and let's just encapsulate the URL here by saying the users /me. Alright, so this will provide this endpoint actually comes with the user setup to get the logged in user, or to get the user object, equals to self.client. This time is going to be a get request. I want to set the get request to that same endpoint by saying self. Right, that will be the URL that we are sending the get request to. And because it's a get request, we only provide the URL, no other parameters is requested. So in here we can start making our set method status code. We can also use our status equals to us status dot 200. Okay, remember we imported the status from the REST framework. Alright, so that is what we should get if everything is fine. Then we can also check for other things. Apart from just checking the status code, we can check for a particular feed. So we can also check for the, say, self.asset, the rest.data, and want to get the email feed. If the email that is going to be returned by this user object is equivalent to the email here. Alright, so we can just grab this email, paste that here, then, and also for us to actually see what is happening here, we can just import pgd, and we're going to say pdg dot trace set trace. Alright, so for this we actually show us what is being returned. So if we save this and but before we bring in the pgd, let's first of all run the test and see what happens. Let me comment this out first and save. So let's run our test one more time. No issue, but we are getting an error. Alright, run to test, feed error one error. Let's see what happened. Okay, the simple reason for that error is in here we are not supposed to pass it like this, just pass the status code directly. We run the test again. Alright, you can see run to test. Okay, that's the 2 tests was passed. If we want to see what's actually transpired in there, we can use this method to actually observe what is going on there, and it will pause the execution and allow us to test. Okay, you can see asset, you can see what is returned asset 200. Okay, you can see okay, let's get the rest of status codes. We can get this 200, right? So let's get the rest data. You can see it's the another user email. So everything actually worked fine. That's why the 2 tests was passed. So this pdg is a kind of a debugging tool in Python that allows you to check and pause your execution and perform some kind of operations between the executions of code. So everything worked fine. So you can quit this. So we can take this out. So we can also write more tests. Now let's get users can create chef book, and this time is almost same thing, because to create a chef book we're actually going to be making a post request. So we're going to say respond should be alright. So the end. Okay, now another way we can also pass in the URL that we're making request to, we can just import reverse, say from, right? So we can just reverse into the URL and we get the URL part. If we go to our URL.file, the create book name is the chef book, then the data, so we can just pass in sample data in here. So we can just, first of all, within this test we can just create some kind of a dictionary of data. Chef model or chef book model has a chef which is supposed to be the logged in user, and in this case we cannot get request to user, so we just get our user instance that we created here. So this is actually our login user. In pass this data in as the data that we are using, and we can also pass the format just like we did, which is going to be alright. So that's that. So once we do that, we can start our setting. So we can just say status start created, which is, now let's write a test to see if users that are not authenticated can get the chef list. Alright, so we've tested if authenticated user can create chef book. Now I want to test if users that are not authenticated, if they can get the chef list. Remember, we created an endpoint to get chef list, and one of the parameters is that the user must be authenticated. So let's test it for users that are not authenticated, if they can actually access that endpoint. So we're going to define the, so by default, once we run our test, it first of all authenticates this user by these simple operations. But what we're going to do, we're going to kind of in this very test, we are going to override something that we've already done before. So we're going to force the authentication to be none by setting the self.client.force authenticate. We'll set the user to none and we'll set the token to none. We have that, we can perform our test. So here we're going to get our respond, and the endpoint for getting a list is chef list. So we'll grab this endpoint, then here we just pass that in, and that's all. We don't need to pass any other parameter, so we need to set this respond by say self.set equals equivalent to the status dot yeah. I think so. Let's try it out and see. Get back to our terminal in here, so I can just clear this and run our test again. Alright, run 4 tests but add 1 error. So let's try and find out where the error is coming from. The reason why we're having that error was because in testing for authenticator can create chef book, remember our data is coming in the form of a dictionary, and in here I went and set the format to be a JSON format. So we'll just take that out. That is not our point now, so it's not gonna, we'll just take that out and save this and run our test again. You can see run 4 tests in 2.18 seconds. Okay, it's trying test database for Alice. So that means our 4 tests was run successfully. Alright, so next we're gonna quickly write a test for user profile to retrieve. So I want to test if we can try to retrieve the user profile, and the URL for is called user profile. And apart from that, you remember the user profile is a detail page, so we need to also pass in the keyword tags also which we are creating. Alright, so that's going to complete this request. And also we're going to start making our sets. Then apart from status code, we can check if the user that is being returned in this profile. So we can say self.asset object. We want to check if the user object is equivalent to the logged in user. So we are setting for 2, checking the status. If it's 200, we are checking if the user that owns this profile is the one that is logged in, because you cannot edit another person's profile. You can only edit your own profile. You can only see your own profile. So that's that. So then I think that's all for retrieving. So let's write that for updating. So I'm going to test, and eventually we're also going to get a response once we send the request, which is the same thing as self.client, but in this time we are going to be performing a put request to. Alright, so we making a put request to this endpoint with this primary key, and also we want to pass in the data that we want to use to update. So if we check if you check your model under our profile, we need the bio. We cannot provide an image right now, but we need the bio, image, phone number, country, and probably the user that is logged in. So I'll just grab the data and paste them in here. Alright, so pasted the data in here, which is a dictionary. So the bio, we are passing test user talk about himself, phone number, the phone number, sample phone number, and alright, so this is the basic information that I want to update. Then here we can start testing our assets. So also just bring that in here, and lastly let's test for the content that is being returned by setting for set equals response dot content. Alright, so we want to check the content of the response. That's the full content, so this should be response. Same with the updating data, but in this case we are going to provide the full response object. This time we should pass the ID. Alright, so the ID of the object that is being returned, and lastly we also need to provide the image, the return object, but in this case it's going to be null. Alright, so we are expecting a null value for this, and also we think that the serializer is providing for us. So the user object, we equivalent the logged in user, which is we just provide the user. Alright, so this is the content that should be returned back from this response, and they run our test, and hopefully everything works fine. Okay, I think we are having one test failure, so let's check the reason for this one. We see run 6 tests in 2.8 seconds, but one of the tests failed. So let's check where we are having a failure. Alright, the reason why we are having such that error is because this data is coming back in a JSON format, and we are actually not providing them in JSON format. So what we're going to do, we're going to import JSON. So we are going to load, call the JSON.load .content. Alright, so that's how we're supposed to do it. So the reason why test is very important. So it's here around 6 tests in 2.8 seconds. Okay, destroying test database. That means all our 6 tests passed. There's no error in them. So we are actually getting the right response that is being any others. Alright, so there are so many things you can test for in your application, but these are just like the basics of a unit test that you can write for your API. Alright guys, this brings us to the end of this very video. Don't forget to subscribe, please and please. I really need your subscription, so subscribe and also give this video a thumbs up. See you guys in the next video.